The winter had just ended, but the winter had just started for BAT.
For those of you who don't know what's going on over at Brookline, is we actually share a facility with Comcast, which is sort of a unique relationship, as you can imagine. It used to be Cablevision, then AT&T, and now Comcast. Traditionally, BAT has had equal access to that studio.
Because we share a building with the cable provider, it's been a sticky relationship since the beginning. We not only share a building, but we share basically an executive director and a engineer.
That is very unique, and that can be very problematic. But up until the point where Comcast took over for AT&T, I think it was a fairly workable progress. Now I think you're finding that Comcast is very aggressive in their business plan. They certainly don't have a record as being someone who is friendly to access.
Once Comcast took over, they decided that they were going to use the studio, which BAT shares. That effectively locks BAT out of using it any evenings at all.
Basically what happened was Comcast sort of announced they were doing this to their own employees, and they never told myself as executive director or my board of directors or the town or anyone else. And I sort of overheard people talking, and I knew all the people who worked for AT&T, and I overheard them, they're whispering about, they're putting in this studio and they're going to do 2 shows from here, and it's going to be, a $2.5 million investment and this and that. So I called the person. There was a VP from Comcast who was here to oversee the transition from AT&T to Comcast, and I asked to meet with him, and we sat down, and I expressed my concerns that, BAT uses that studio half the time. This person basically assured me that we would be taken into consideration. So I then called the town and let them know what was happening, just so they knew. And the town decided to have a meeting with Comcast, myself, and some of the board of directors, and the town to sort of discuss this.
I've been extremely disappointed with the way that Comcast has really handled the situation since they became involved in the town. And they just really did a great disservice to the town when they, in effect, closed Brookline Access Television down without any notice, with hours, if perhaps not a couple of days' notice to the selectmen, which was really contrary to the spirit of the license, if not the letter of the license, probably contrary to the letter of the license as well. And it's just been a very disappointing experience.
That was probably a Wednesday, and by Monday, the studio was inoperable.
And by Monday, there was a meeting, and they said, well, only things we're doing to the studio are 2 things. We're just painting it, and we're changing the ceiling tiles. Well, if you looked at the studio was all dismantled.
And Comcast then said, well, we already removed the ceiling tiles from the studio, and the ceiling tiles were acoustically treated, and that basically rendered the studio inoperable. So BAT was out, and that was basically the beginning of April. And for the next 5 to 6 weeks, Comcast had tons of workers in there putting in all new equipment and knocking down walls and putting up a permanent set, and putting in all this great new equipment. And then they told BAT, we could come back in. So we were somewhat excited that there was new equipment, but we found that the set took up a lot of space and it was permanent, and we can't move it, we can't adjust the lights, so we were limited to a very small amount of space in the corner, which wasn't acceptable to the town and it wasn't acceptable to BAT. So we decided that, this is not going to work. And on top of that, Comcast said, well, you can no longer have nights, Monday through Friday. We traditionally have Wednesday and Thursday nights. They said you can't have any nights between Monday and Friday because we're going to be using it to do our live news and sports show.
In effect, by not being able to use the studio, Brookline Access Television is being deprived of the new equipment that Comcast has installed. The license requires Comcast to allow us a 50-50 use not only of the studio space but also of the equipment, and we are not using the equipment at all now. So again, that's a matter that we're going to litigate in the courts.
The license itself, I think you picked up on this right away, calls for 50% of the all hours measured on Monday to Friday weekly basis. I'm going to eliminate the middle of the night shift, even though some people do produce time then. But if you take any of the reasonable hours, 8 to midnight, 8 to 10 p.m., you'll still find that Comcast is making the studio available for way over 50% of the time. And the license doesn't say 50% of the time, 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. It's 24 hours if you read it literally. I think, in practice, people have many shows in the middle of the night. But the studio is available for more than 50% of the time.
It's clearly necessary for Brookline Access Television to have access to the studio during the evenings because that's when the producers, who typically have daytime jobs, are available to do the programming. We believe that the license requires Comcast to make evening hours available to Brookline Access Television, and they have shut that down for BAT and have basically forbidden Brookline Access Television to use the studio during evening hours, and we think that's a clear violation of the license.
And there's a further provision in the license that requires Comcast to work in good faith to ensure the shared use of all facilities is accomplished in an equitable and timely manner. So as I said, BATV has had the use of the studio to produce its programs on Wednesdays and Thursday evenings for at least 7 years.
And I think Comcast is saying it's our studio. We'll give you 50% of the hours, but we'll decide what the hours are. And the way it's been in the past is this has been a shared studio. The cable company has always owned the equipment, but it's always been a studio that is shared. It didn't belong to one group or the other. So that's the main focus of the argument, and that's where a judge is going to have to decide what exactly the language means.
So they put in a large permanent set. Traditionally, BAT has utilized half of the studio. But as part of this permanent set, there's a large round table in the middle of the room, and it has lights hanging down around the table, hanging down from the grid on poles. So basically, we can't light anything in our traditional corner over here because all the lights are hanging down, and they offered us basically, 2 rows of lighting grid that we could use, which is a complete waste of time.
Over on this side of the room, another corner, we would show that BAT's producers generally use these 2 walls in a standard studio format to shoot interview shows. Other times they use more of the room. They did not explore how they can still use most of that room. The things Comcast has put there are not as permanent as the paper suggests. The lighting is a big thing in the paper. The lights that we put in, apparently we don't want them to move. But we're willing to hire and flew up a consultant whose only job is to light studios professionally for HBO, for whatever profession we want.
Comcast is supposed to supply a full-time engineer to BAT. It hasn't really worked that way. And then in addition, Comcast is supposed to hire the executive director. Comcast has not hired me, so BAT is actually paying my salary.
Well, I think we felt we had no alternative other than to sue. As I mentioned earlier, we have never brought a lawsuit against a cable provider in the 8 or so years that I've been on the committee, and I'm not sure we have ever historically brought one for the last 3 or 4 decades. I'm not aware of any situation where the town has had to sue a cable provider.
Before you go to court, one of the things you have to do is you have to call back the cable provider, which is Comcast, and let them put in a new offer. The offer that they had made previously was the space downstairs, 600 square feet, plus $250,000 worth of new equipment.
And then they said, the deal is, though, you have to give up your office space upstairs if you want this. And we immediately said no. So they came back and they said, all right, that was sort of a pipe dream. I think they gave up on that quickly. They said, you guys can keep the offices. You move downstairs to Celtic Vision. We'll give you $200,000 to renovate it and $250,000 for equipment.
Ultimately, as time went on, I think BAT's board of directors and myself and other people I spoke with in the community felt that this studio was going to be limiting us. It didn't leave us enough room for what we do, what we want to do, what we might do in the future. And we decided that, this probably isn't the best idea for us to take the studio, because once we do it, we're in there and we have to live with the consequences, and it was certainly a very small space.
The biggest issue is what's a better deal? Sharing the studio with a company that's obviously hostile to access, or taking a studio of our own that's not going to be that great.
And when you look around the country, Comcast has taken steps to separate themselves from PEG access centers. And Brookline Access Television is one of the only places in the country left where Comcast is the cable provider that shares a facility. Everywhere else it's been separated.
And the question is, if we go to court, what's the solution? Does CNA pack up and leave? I don't think that's a realistic goal. So what happens? Do we go back to sharing at best, or do we try and take the studio and so it's a tough decision.
In this negotiation, the town should go to Comcast and say, look, we want 7,500 square feet. Go find it, go rent it, build a studio, and provide for it for the next number of years of the contract. I mean, it's insane that between Boston, which has, the Taj Mahal of facilities, including 3 studios and all kinds of money, and us, which for 20,000 people, we too have a lot of stuff in Newton. Brookline should certainly have the same.
Where the town has had to sue a cable provider. It was just plain and simple a situation where Comcast said, from our point of view, we're just not going to do what the license requires. And so we had no alternative. We also are going to, in the near future, find ourselves in a situation where we will be negotiating a renewal of the license with Comcast.
So basically, what we need to do to vote tonight is to vote in favor of not authorizing, but in favor of supporting the town's efforts to go forward. I'm going to make that motion. I'm not going to cut off debate if anybody wants to talk about any other aspects of this, but I'll make that motion. So there's a motion to authorize Tom to send a letter on our behalf saying that the board has voted in favor of supporting the town's efforts.
Okay. Okay. So make the motion.
I made the motion. Anybody have anything else they want to add or say?
I'll second the motion.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous vote.
I think we are going to win, yes.
And I think that the ramifications of this, it's not just affecting BAT, it affects access across the country.
That's right. We are really a model for this David and Goliath thing, really,
right.
Which is really what it is.
And on top of that, the way one of the gentlemen put it to me is like, you guys won hometown last year. Here you are, basically the top access center in the country for our budget size. And if they do this to you, what are they going to do to the smaller stations?
Exactly.
So it's a very risky proposition, but I think the town, is fighting for something they believe in. I think a lot of people would see that and start shaking in their boots, because that's a big corporation they're taking out.
Show of hands, who's in the middle of renegotiation, or soon to be within the next, say, 2 or 3 years?
2 or 3 minutes.
Oh, 2 or 3, well, okay. Is anyone sooner than that?
Who's it gonna be? Are you gonna let it be you? What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take to stand up to people like this?
We understand that this is not a traditional overall excellent submission, but we felt that it was important to tell this story Despite these limitations, BAT has continued to produce programming this year.